Our Highline Voices, 106.5 KQWZ LP FM. Connecting Highline and our region. Share your story. Our Highline Voices, history, cultural heritage, art, performances, contemporary, pop culture. We are very motivated to provide a vibrant community museum and authentic social gathering place. It truly takes a village to raise a museum. Despite the challenges, our daily inspiration is our eagerness to build a stronger and more connected community. This museum is from the community to the community. Our passion is for our visitors to have access to a broad spectrum of information sources and cultural perspectives. Our Highline Voices.
Hi, everyone. This is Nancy. I'm the director of the Highline Heritage Museum. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We have Sharlene joining us today, and she's going to be talking a lot more about the work that she does. And it's just going to have a really interesting conversation. But first of all, before we start, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for allowing us to interview you. Thank you for sharing more about who you are and then the work that you do. So once again, welcome to our show.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Yes, I'm Sharlene Santana. I'm a professor in the biology department and the Curator of Mammals at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture here in Seattle. And a lot of the work that I do is in trying to understand patterns of biodiversity, why there are some kinds of animals, particularly mammals, that are more diverse than others. And we do a combination of different kinds of studies that use museum collections, but we also do field work and other types of experimental lab work to get at those questions.
Yeah, I think that just for anyone, what it means to curator, because not everyone might understand. I mean, it is very interesting how nowadays people are using that term curator and for almost everything, like curator in music, curator in food. Traditionally, that term curator was based in museums. And so just to remind or to share to everyone that the term curator is, it can be applicable in curator of collections, curator of exhibits, and now she's going to be sharing more about that and what she does. What I find it interesting is about the field that she is working on and how maybe we can have a dialogue and how do we connect with, in contrast from the tropicals to this area. But yeah, just let us know, how do you start in this field? Where you from? And then why this field? What is it that got your attention? Why are you passionate about this topic? And if you are, like, what is it that really gets you going?
Yeah, so I think we have to go back really far back to my childhood. So I grew up in Venezuela, so a very tropical place. And even though, I mean, I grew up in a city, but even in the cities there, we had a lot of fruit trees in our backyard. So you get a lot of still diversity of animals, birds and plants. And I was always a very curious child about animals and plants and nature and why things look different, like why this bird eats this thing. And so over the course of my studies, I just really loved studying biology in particular. So that led me to going to university to study biology. And in Venezuela, when you go on that biology track, it's already sort of towards being a scientist. It's separate from like biology that you would study to go to medical school or vet school. So from fairly early on, I had to make up my mind that this is something that was interesting enough to me to, go to college to study it. And when I was in college, it was really reaffirming that that was the career path for me, because it was, I love learning and science is all about learning. And so it really, the discipline just really spoke to me. And then, as I was going to college and I got opportunities to do field work and just be more out in nature and experiencing more of that biodiversity. And that I think really crystallized that this was a field that I wanted to explore. Also in relation to museums, to one of the professors that I was training with, he also did a lot of collecting and preserving museum specimens for study to describe new species or to study their adaptations. And so that also was something that I think fairly early on from college years really interested me as well.
Yeah, the biodiversity it's not something that I know much about, and so I find it interesting to actually talk to you and like, okay, what is that, and how do you decide to do that to that field? I do hope that as our communities, there's not that many curators in the state that are Latinas or people of color or minorities, and so I do hope that as they maybe see this interview or start reflecting, that the kids can, there's no limitation as to what they want to do. They can, they're welcome to go to different fields. The museum field is something that I do want the kids and the younger generations and the minority groups to know that it is an option for them. It's not like, I don't see myself in a museum. Why should I even think about even being in that profession? And so one of the reasons why I was so intrigued by doing this interview with you is just the idea of how do we, even by just us talking and meeting with each other and talking about work, that we're letting know those little ones that, yes, you can do it too. It's okay to do it. You have that permission. So from Venezuela to this region, what was your first impressions when you look at the biodiversity? I know that professionally you're working in the tropical one, but then you live in here. You live in coexist in this biodiversity in Pacific Northwest. What you think of the maybe similarities or maybe differences that you find from starting one area and then while, like all of us living on it, we experience the climate changes, but then we also what's around us and in the water and in the forest and in different ways that we engage with nature, and then biodiversity. And I mean, even my backyard, for example, all the way from rabbits to coyotes to birds and all kinds of things there. One little animal that I confess, I don't like snakes. I don't like snakes. I don't like snakes. And even though they look so cute and small and all that, I don't like snakes. But that's me, right? And so going back to you, when you see the contrast, like you grew up in Venezuela, it is so diverse and it is so rich. And then you come here and then you live in and engage in interacting while still studying what is the process in you? How do you take those two fields all at one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess it's such a stark contrast, right? You think about the rainforests in Central and South America, where we do a lot of our work. And you come up here at Washington, we also have rainforests, but they're in a temperate region. So one big difference is just the sheer number of species for, let's say, most group of plants and animals. In the tropics, you have just an explosion. It's just so much more diverse in terms of number of species compared to here, but also the species are different. So even though the diversity just in sheer numbers might be lower for some groups up here in Washington, it's still super fascinating and interesting because they are adapted to this place. We live in a place that it's cold, a place that doesn't have a lot of sunlight for a lot of time of the year, and yet all these species are still thriving here. So one group that I specialize on is bats. So they're extremely diverse in the tropics, and both in terms of the number of species, but also in terms of the roles that they play in nature. So you have bats that are eating insects, you have fruit bats, you have nectar bats, you have vampire bats. So a lot of diversity in terms of their ecology. When you come here to Washington, all the bats eat insects. But still, even though you don't have a lot of diet diversity, the species are doing all sorts of really interesting things. You have some species that are eating moths. You have smaller species that are eating small insects. You have some species that look very similar to one another, and yet they're eating different things. Their echolocation is different. So I think anywhere you can find a lot of interesting sort of patterns and connections, despite differences in levels of diversity, because ecosystems, I think, are inherently interesting to try to understand, and the way that species have adapted to those ecosystems is super interesting too.
Yeah, and I think of us like, I would think myself as an immigrant, like growing up in one specific ecosystem and just being accustomed to it. Well, mine was a little wacky. I'm from Mexico City, so the city is not like I had that much of a experience with nature, but it's still, I'm growing up and then finding accessible every time we went out of town, being able to really experience what like you mentioned, all the biodiversity that we experience there. But then coming here, such a different, and I think that I don't know. Probably this is a question that I can ask you. How accurate that is that human is one of the most living creatures in the planet that can adapt to the changes. They can survive through the changes. And one of the things that always makes me worry is like going to a zoo. Like when you see these different species from all over the planet into one place, and then knowing that the ecosystems are different, and so like they're adapting. I don't know if they're flourishing. I don't know if they are getting stronger, or they can actually procreate and then continue to have a strong survival rate. But the idea of us adapting to changes, adapting to what is around us, I think that regardless of the species, either we can be humans or cats or dogs or snakes or bats, they still have the idea of surviving into all changes and surviving into what's around us, and all the way from our diets to the climate changes and everything. But then also culturally, like for us human beings, like all the culture that comes with it. I know that in our pre-Hispanic cultures, they have lots of legends on, the jaguars and wildcats and then how that is integrated in our culture, in our traditions and everything. And so I find it very fascinating what you do. I love the idea of observing. I love the idea of learning the contrast between and how do we engage locally. We are by the water, it's a beach. So it's very interesting because we got a beach next to us, and then we got mountains, and then we got forests. And with that, we had this really rich ecosystem with this really rich diversity that, like it is for us normal to see a sea lion on the water. Oh yeah, it is normal. But I don't know how normal would that be if I was in Mexico City. Like, no, that would be like you are just in the movies or something. It's not something that is real. With going back to your field with the bats, I get the feeling that we do have, I don't know how common it is for being so close to the water to have the bats on your backyard, but I do believe I have bats in my backyard. Is that true? I have never really asked anyone about it. Is that really a thing? Do we live in such a close proximity to cities with bats?
Oh yeah, they're all over the city too. So I also live close to water, and so at dusk in the summer you can see them flying around and eating little bugs. So you probably have them too. So depending on the species, some species are more resilient. You were talking about change and survival. So some species of bats are going to be more resilient to tolerating what we've done to their habitat, like, cutting down trees and just modifying the landscape. And the same is true for other species like birds and squirrels and all sorts of other animals, right? Some of them are more resilient than others. But yeah, you see bats, some bat species that are still thriving in the city.
Yeah, that's what I think I told my daughter, I think those are bats. She's like, no. I was like, yeah, they are. I don't think the birds will be flying like that and then flapping the wings like that.
They're very fluttery. Yeah. I think I still saw just a few days ago, even though we had, some pretty cold days, I saw a bat flying very early in the morning which I was surprised because they should be starting to go into hibernation here. But I think because we had warmer weather a little before, maybe they're just hanging on still.
And so when you use the term hibernation, that means that it is only a specific times of the year that you will be able to see them. Where are those times? I'm assuming summer and spring, maybe?
Yeah, summer and spring. Yeah. So they'll start going into hibernation around this time of year. And then they'll emerge from hibernation, starting in the spring.
How long do they live? I mean, what is the life expectancy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there are a lot of bat species. There are over 1,400 bat species, so very diverse group.
Wow.
And so, but we don't have enough data to know like what's the life expectancy, on average across a lot of bat species. But there are records in terms of like the longest lifespan that a bat has been recorded for a bat in the wild, and that's about 42 years for a bat that's about the size of a mouse. And they know that because somebody put a tag on that bat, decades and decades ago, and then they recapture it, so they know at least it's 40 years old.
Well, there's two things that you just blow my mind away. One is the number of species. I was thinking in the hundreds, not thousands. Wow, that's just like hard to. And we only one human species, right? Only one kind.
Only one kind. That's right.
Only one. I mean, we all have our own different ethnicities and different diverse backgrounds. We're still one human species. So just keep that in mind, everyone out there. We're talking about thousands of species on bat. Wow. So that was number one. That is, I'm still processing it. And number two is how long they last. I don't know why I felt that it was, like maybe 15 maximum, like even like, I would think like the life of a dog, of a cat, even though they're younger, but still, I was not expecting something that will last more than 15 years. And now when you're saying 44, you say that?
42, yeah.
42, wow.
Yeah. It's a real sort of scientific mystery. Like how are they able to live for so long? So one idea, this bat where that was recorded, it's a species that hibernates. So there is now some evidence that when they go into hibernation, there's some rejuvenation that happens in terms of their genetics and their chromosomes. There's some changes there that might allow them to sort of have that longer lifespan without their sort of DNA being damaged by age, as it happens to all of us. And so, but still, it's a very active area of study. So we could learn a lot from bats as to how to, attain like longer lifespans and still be, functional. Yeah.
Wow. No, that is. I don't know. When I think of a bat, I think only one species. I think of that pop cultural.
Most people do, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, like the pop cultural influence is present, where it's just there's only one type of bat, but thousands, and then last longer. Now I'm intrigued by them too. When interacting with them locally, I know that your field is more in the tropicals, but once again, we're still coexisting in the same, sharing the same space. Is the influence that you learn from the species here influence in the work that you do in the tropicals? I mean, are there any connections when you study one or the other?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the fieldwork that I do is in the tropics, but there are studies that we do that it's just sort of across all of bats. And the local bats are part of that big diversity of all bats on one hand. But then on the other, it has made me question, I think, some of my, preconceptions that I had just from studying bats in the tropics. For example, in tropics, you have many species that are coexistent, and they all look very different from one another. So their anatomy is different, their behavior is different, and that's a way how they can sort of distribute the resources that they have in nature. That's sort of a way in which we understand how species avoid competing one another, which could lead to one species becoming extinct if one sort of wins in the competition for resources, say for food or for shelter, right? And then that leads to those species looking different. But here you have some species that look super similar. Like there are a lot of little small brown little bats that you look at them, and some of them you can't even tell apart by studying their anatomy in detail. You have to do genetics to tell one species from the other. So that's really interesting, because if they look the same, how come they're two different species at a genetic level? Is it that they're sleeping in different places? Are they eating different things? Can they not communicate with one another because their frequencies that they produce their sounds at are different? So those are really interesting questions that makes the systems here just very different, again, from the tropics, but just teaches us about different mechanisms of how these animals can coexist with one another.
There's one comment that you shared that got my attention, like making the distinction, how do they communicate, how they eat, what the process, and would them make them be a different species, and then with the DNA. But don't we all do that? I mean, us or me from Mexico City, you got my Mexican food and my music and my traditions. Would that make me a different species from someone who came from Australia, or someone that came from, from, I don't know, India? Or, I mean, we all have different lifestyles and how we engage with our ecosystem and how we express ourselves. So when you're saying that you studying the different species, I always assumed there was something physical, like very physical or genetic, but no behavioral, no something that is reacting to an environment. And so now the question I have for you is, when you look at the different species, you're looking at the differences as how they behave. And that's why you make that distinction as a species. Because if that's the case, then we are the human beings. We can also say that we have different species, right? Because based on the behavior. Yeah. I maybe this is a weird question to ask.
No, it's just not at all. Yeah. Yeah, no, you are right. Yeah, we define the species based on mostly their genetics. Like there has to be a certain difference in their genes, such that, say, for example, for mammals, if they interbreed, they will not have viable offspring. And that is also reflected in their anatomy and the adaptations that they have. But differences in behavior can be, the sounds that they can produce in the case of bats to echolocate or communicate. But that's also dictated by their anatomy, because it's just the vocal cords have to have a certain, shape. Their muscles in their voice box has to have a certain characteristic. So the anatomy is still determining the behavior that can lead to those differences in behavior. I should also, I don't know, your comment also makes me think that humans, we're just also extremely variable in terms of everything, right? In terms of like what we look like, what we behave, what we sound like. And so we're a very unique species in terms of what we see in our variation compared to some other species of animals. I think when you look at a population of bats, you're going to see some minor differences, but nothing like what we see ever in humans.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why we're doing this interview is how do we connect each other in Highline and then in the region. And then, so this interview is allowing me to see where are we living, where we are coexisting with, and how do we actually exchange that information, either through our ecosystem or habitat or way of how we behave. But when from a scientific perspective, which I have nothing, I'm very ignorant with this topic. But so as I'm looking at you, like, I want to ask you all these questions, right? But I don't know if it's appropriate for these radio stations. So I'm trying to make sure that we find the connection with us locally. But then I think is also the question of if we think about the term diversity, what does that mean? And how we apply it on an everyday basis, either as the humans, but then also in our biodiversity, our habitat. I just find it really fascinating on the work that you do and how you are not only studying, maybe not officially on your field locally, but you, like I say, you are, because from your scientific eyes and point of view, you're able to compare some of the differences or similarities in here and there. Let's talk about culture. So from Venezuela, adapting into the Pacific Northwest. Venezuela, think of it, I don't have the pleasure of being there, but I hope that I will get an opportunity to go there. My what is in my brain, what it comes out of my brain is a place where it's nice and warm and welcoming and rich in color and fruits and the diversity that you got all levels. And then coming here, which is completely not different, but like the weather, like, for example, super cold in the winter time. For us, it's not like we're in Alaska or on the Arctic, but it's still super cold for us. We are able to adapt to new behaviors as an immigrants. We come in and adapt in language. We adapt into exposing ourselves to different food, exposing ourselves to different way of wearing clothing and or tastes. Like before here, I used to just concentrate on, just what is provided in my environment. But here you can actually try, I don't know, Greek food and Italian food and sushi and all this yummy food that you find out there, and how I'm extending and I'm exposing myself to different languages and I'm exposing myself to different traditions. And my question is, culture, how different are we from animals, all the species, when it comes to adapting ourselves into a different environment? And how I know that the life expectancy might decrease by changing, that there's not much about that, being able to adapt, but we are adapting and we are trying to survive and we are trying to evolve. And I imagine with the climate changes taking place all around, that we'll be seeing that not just us as human beings, but also in our fauna and flora all around. I see our diversity culturally, because socially, that's how we're engaging. But I think it's also surviving. We're trying to survive. And that's the reason why we came here too. How do you view cultural diversity, or how do you find any common ground between animals and humans, and when it comes to adapting to a different environment and a different culture and a different habitat? Am I?
Yeah.
Is this complicated, or you?
No, that's a good question. Yeah. So there's a concept that we use when it's called plasticity. So it's like how much either an individual, or we can look at it as a whole population or a species, how much flexibility they have to change with their environment, either in their behavior or their anatomy over the course of time as the environment is changing. And we do see different degrees of that across different animal species, plant species. And so we were talking earlier about some of these urban species like crows, right? They're very smart also. They're very intelligent animals, but they also have a lot of flexibility in terms of the things that they will eat. And pigeons are another good example of that, right? They barely build a nest, right? So they have like a lot of flexibility where they can lay their eggs, and so they can really thrive in this different and changing environment. So we see that all throughout nature, just animals and plants just having different degrees of flexibility that have been sort of shaped over the course of their evolution as well. And so animals that have a less flexibility to adapt will probably go extinct if the change in their environment is really fast. And that's why we're so worried about how climate change is going to affect a lot of species, because many species are adapted to just living under very specific and narrow conditions. And those are the first species that will probably go if the changes that are accompanying climate change, are going to be very different from those conditions, because it's too fast for them or even evolution to occur and allow them to adapt to new conditions. And then you also asked about maybe culture too, in terms of language and food and things like that. There's some really interesting studies in a few groups of I know mammals because that's what I study. In terms of bats, they are because they communicate with sound. There's some species that vary depending on where the population is located. They have like dialects, basically, like their sound frequencies are a little different in one population versus another population. There are also some really interesting studies that have been done in captivity with naked mole rats. They're this like little burrowing naked, they don't have any hair rats that look really weird, that live underground. And they have a social system that is kind of like bees and termites. They have a queen, and they have workers, and they have other individuals that take care of the young. And they communicate a lot through sounds too. And they have found that scientists have actually measured these type of sounds that they make to communicate more frequently. They call them soft chirps. And they find that the characteristic of that sound varies from one colony to the other. And it's not genetic. Like if you take a little young naked mole rat from one colony, transfer it to the other, it will learn sort of the dialect of the other colony. And one interesting thing too is like the queens seem to sort of maintain the the integrity and the consistency of their dialect within their colony. So if a queen dies, then they measure like how the chirps vary, and they tend to vary a lot. Like everything goes into chaos, and then when there's a new queen, everything sort of normalizes, and everybody goes back to their like normal accent, I guess. So lots of interesting things that in terms of how animals communicate, and something that could be interpreted somewhat as culture, I guess, characteristics of that social group as well.
Those behaviors. I mean, imagine what happens when we don't have our moms. In many cases, there's a lot of people that don't have their moms, right? So I am empathetic on those situations, but the ones that we are lucky enough to grow up with a very strict mom, oh my goodness, when she's not around and when I'm around, it's like madness runs. I can see that happen. Or even if it's a teacher, the teacher is not around, what happens in the classroom? It just all goes bananas. And so I think that some type of order and some type of lead. And I love this I'm going to mix a little bit of that and then cultural here and gender here. I like that some of these species are leading, with females are the ones that are leading some of these groups. And I love that. I love that that organic. In some species, you see a very the packs and really animals that are really male dominated, leading their own groups. But then there are some of them that are the females. They're like the ones who are guiding this, and I don't know. I do like I would like to highlight our gender too. I like to highlight that the things that we do and how do we contribute to the healthy ecosystem. And it's a balance of everything. It's not one or the other, but it's a balance of it. I really love that. One, you're a scientist. Two, that you can see that you're exposed to the diversity, not just in your professional, but personally, on the way your upbringing versus how you live it now. And then three, or genders, or roles in a society. And then with a minority groups to say, yes, you can come and you can dream on anything you want and do it. We only got a few more minutes left on this interview. And so I just wanted to see if there's any other last comment that you would like to share, and any of those angles that I just shared, either as a woman, as a Latina, as a scientific, as a curator, as just a person that, as an immigrant that has been exposed on the different climates and adapting to those changes, all the way up to just general observations that you have seen in your career with the fields that you're working in. So it's like a big buffet of, you can select one of those topics. Any last comment that you have for that?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to something you mentioned earlier that we didn't get to expand upon about the importance of role models in our fields, or representation in general of all these different identities that are still minoritized in a lot of our fields, and that really speaks to me. I didn't also know any like female, not even female curators. I mean, when I was going to college, and much less, somebody who looked like me either. And it's really, I think, encouraging. I think, how things are changing, and we can provide, I think, the younger generation, at least with images and places, and where they can think of themselves in these roles, and think about the things that they will bring with themselves from these backgrounds that are underrepresented. And I think it's exciting to think about how that will move our fields in new directions, that will make them, it will enrich them, and it will help us learn more things than we had, so far, with the sort of the more constrained perspectives of the people who have been dominating our fields.
Yeah, there's I've been researching for more than 20 years the factors of why minorities don't come to museums, and I'm just going to be straightforward. I think that is no need for me to hide the sun with one finger when it's evident that it's just a lack of representation, is a lack of them connecting to the space, is lack of even seeing if it's an opportunity for them to be part of on a field, in a scientific or even in a museum field. And you are representing both. And so it's one of those fields where you don't see much of a diversity, and it's a pleasure to get connected with you even through this interview, and then hopefully the moms listening, the parents listening, the friends, the sisters to little ones, to say, hey, you like animals, it is okay to, if you love a cat, maybe you have passion for cats, and maybe you can. Oh, I'm just saying cat as an example, but I know that people are attracted to bees, to bats, and some people snakes, which I don't like, but it's still, everyone has their own preference on. And then knowing that, yes, it is possible, yes, it's okay, yes, you had that permission, yes, it's yeah. And so I don't want to talk about me on this field much, but I think you represent a little bit of that, in a sense of giving back to communities by giving them permission to say, yes, you are welcome. And one of the things that I have tell them, especially when I'm doing these private tours or field trips on groups that are no English speaking and sometimes in completely Spanish, I will tell them, if you go to a museum and you don't feel connected or that you belong, don't ever take the blame on you. It's not your fault. It's not on you. Is the museum who is not designing the space for you, and who is not actually thinking about you. And so if they are not, yes, it's normal. You don't feel welcome, then you don't want to come back. You don't want to be a member, because obviously, why would you do that? But one element that I would like to start promoting is, don't take the blame, don't take the guilt. It is something, because I'm not educated, because I'm an immigrant, because I don't see myself reflecting on the space, I'm not welcome. Like, no, let's start making the changes that, yes, you are welcome. And yes, and I'm not saying all museums, I'm just saying that we all have different experiences with museums. But the idea that there's a very clear reason as why the percentages are really low on minority groups coming into, especially the first generation, the immigrant generation, why they don't come to museums. There's way more factors, like the list is big. But I'm glad to have opportunity to interview you. Thank you. I talk a lot, so any last comment you want to add to it?
Oh, no. That was I think that was a wonderful way to wrap it up. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope we can chat again.
I love that. I would love that to connect with something that you do, and then expose and then share with here. That would be great. Well, thank you everyone for listening tonight. We are, as you can see, we so thankful for Sharlene to share her space with us and to share her knowledge. So bye everyone, and hopefully you'll connect with us soon. Okay, bye.
Our Highline Voices, 106.5 KQWZ FM.
We envision ourselves sitting at a round table where no one is the leader and stories are heard respectfully, regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation, disabilities, or ethnicity. We want to embrace our differences and similarities. We are creating a place where visitors can connect with the stories and each other. Our mission is we collect, preserve, and tell the stories of the Highline region and its people. We want to extend our mission outside the walls of the museum. Our Highline Voices represents us all, honoring our past, celebrating our present, and uniting to cultivate our future. This project allows us to reach out to demographics who might be unable to visit the museum. People with disabilities, low-income families, people who don't trust museums, and more. In partnership, we are launching a locally programmed new radio station at the museum, featuring recorded and live Highline's heritage, history, culture, arts, and more. Are you interested in sharing your story? Email director@highlinemuseum.org.